A blood-stained crown, a kingdom torn apart by a midnight betrayal. Alpha King Alistair tore through the frozen woods, desperate to find his heavily pregnant mate. What he discovered at dawn shattered his ruthless soul, his bleeding Luna, fiercely guarding the impossible. 9 newborn pups she kept alive through the brutal night. According to the forbidden archives of the Lycan Order, the winter of 1492 was recorded as the Frost of the Bleeding Moon. It was a winter so severe that the river Ouse froze solid, and the ancient pines of the Ethelgard forest shattered under the weight of the ice. Within the impenetrable stone walls of High Reach Castle, Alpha King Alistair ruled the northern territories with an iron fist and a tactical mind. Yet, for all his terrifying reputation on the battlefield, Alistair had one known vulnerability: his Luna, Genevieve. Genevieve was a woman of the fiercely independent Silver Lake clan. She was not a fragile noblewoman. She was a warrior in her own right, bearing the scars of past territorial wars. But that December, she was vulnerable. She was carrying the king's heirs, and her pregnancy was anomalous. Lycan pregnancies typically yielded 1, perhaps 2 pups. Genevieve was carrying a litter so massive that the royal physician, a supposedly loyal man named Dr. Arthur Pendleton, whispered of ancient prophecies. The sheer magical and physical drain on her body left her bedridden, feverish, and dependent on the castle's defences. The tragedy began on the eve of the winter solstice. Alistair had been drawn away from High Reach by a coordinated, massive incursion of rogue wolves on the eastern border. It was a classic military feint, a tactic so brilliantly executed that military historians still debate its origin. Alistair, riding with 300 of his best warriors, left the castle in the hands of his sworn beta, Lord Reginald. Reginald was a man who had fought back-to-back with Alistair for 2 decades. He was godfather to Alistair's deceased younger brother. He was family. But jealousy is a slow-acting poison. Reginald had secretly allied with the rogue factions, promised the Northern Crown in exchange for one simple, devastating task: the eradication of Alistair's bloodline. It happened just past midnight. The blizzard was howling so loudly it masked the sound of the iron portcullis being raised from the inside. There were no battle cries, only the sickening, muffled sounds of throats being slit in the dark. Reginald had laced the evening ale of the inner guard with wolfsbane, rendering them paralyzed before the rogue assassins flooded the corridors. Genevieve awoke not to the sound of fighting, but to the sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood seeping under her heavy oak door. Her maternal instincts, amplified by the impending birth, screamed at her. She struggled from her bed, her massive belly making every movement an agony. The door burst open, but it was not an assassin. It was her handmaiden, Beatrice, clutching a bleeding wound on her shoulder. "My Luna, you must run," Beatrice choked out, falling to her knees. "Reginald," he opened the gates. "They are coming for the pups." Genevieve did not panic. The blood of the Silver Lake clan ran cold in the face of death. She grabbed a heavy fur cloak and her ceremonial hunting dagger. "Come with me, Beatrice," she ordered, hoisting the dying woman up. But Beatrice shook her head, wedging a heavy iron chair under the door handle. "I will buy you time," the handmaiden whispered, her eyes glowing with a sudden, fierce yellow light as she prepared to shift into her wolf form. "Go through the servants' chute to the crypts. The river is frozen. Run into the Ethelgard." With a final heartbroken glance at her loyal friend, Genevieve slipped behind the tapestry that concealed the castle's ancient escape route. Seconds later, she heard the heavy oak door splinter, followed by the agonizing howl of Beatrice fighting to her death. The crypts were terrifyingly dark, smelling of damp earth and centuries of decaying bones. Genevieve navigated the stone labyrinth purely by touch, her breathing ragged. Her body was already beginning to betray her. The adrenaline was triggering early labor. Sharp, paralyzing contractions seized her spine, forcing her to lean heavily against the frozen stone walls. When she finally emerged from the iron grate at the base of the castle, the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. Before her stretched the vast, terrifying expanse of the Ethelgard forest, an abyss of black pines and driving snow. Behind her, the highest towers of High Reach were beginning to glow with the orange light of unholy fires. She stepped onto the frozen River Ouse, her boots slipping on the slick ice. Every step was a battle against her own biology. She could feel the pups shifting frantically within her, sensing their mother's distress. Just a little further, she whispered to her unborn children, clutching her stomach, "I will not let them have you. I swear it." But Reginald was not a fool. Standing on the castle battlements, he saw the tiny, dark figure moving across the white river. He smiled, a sickening twist of his scarred lips. He turned to his rogue lieutenant, a massive, scarred brute named Silas. "She's on the river," Reginald ordered. "Take the hunting hounds, bring me her head, and cut the pups from her belly. I want them as trophies." 2 hours later, Alpha King Alistair stood amidst a field of slaughtered rogues on the eastern border. His claws were coated in crimson, his chest heaving. It was only when the last enemy fell that he realized the truth. They hadn't fought to win. They had fought to delay. A horrific, gut-wrenching snap echoed in his chest, the breaking of the spiritual pack bond. Hundreds of his loyal subjects back at High Reach were dying. But the bond he shared with Genevieve, it was flickering, weak and erratic, like a candle in a hurricane. "To the castle!" Alistair roared, his voice a thunderous shockwave that shook the snow from the trees. He didn't bother shifting to his human form. His massive, midnight black wolf tore across the tundra at a speed that left his soldiers in the dust. The journey that took hours on horseback took him less than 40 minutes. When Alistair breached the gates of High Reach, he found a slaughterhouse. But his glowing red eyes sought only one scent. He found Reginald in the great hall, celebrating with a goblet of stolen wine. The beta didn't even have time to scream. Alistair hit him like a freight train, pinning him to the stone floor and ripping his left arm entirely from its socket. Reginald shrieked, coughing up blood. "She's dead, Alistair!" He laughed maniacally, spit flying from his lips. "Silas hunted her into the woods. The cold took her. Your bloodline dies tonight." Alistair didn't grant him a swift death. He crushed Reginald's windpipe just enough to ensure a slow, agonizing suffocation, then launched himself through the shattered stained glass window, landing perfectly on the frozen river below. He picked up Genevieve's scent. It was terrifyingly faint, masked by the heavy snowfall, but he could smell something else. Blood. Her blood. Deep within the darkest heart of the Ethelgard, Genevieve was losing her war against nature. She had managed to lose Silas and the hounds by crossing a patch of thin ice. The heavy rogues had fallen through, swept away by the freezing undercurrents. But the exertion had broken her water. She had collapsed at the base of a colossal, hollowed-out ancient oak tree, a place known in local folklore as the Widow's Root. The cold was absolute. It was the kind of cold that burned the skin and slowed the heart. Genevieve dragged herself into the dark hollow of the tree, scraping the frozen moss with her bare, bleeding hands to create a makeshift nest. Then, the true agony began. She had no medicine, no warm water, no Arthur to guide her. She only had the primal, desperate instinct of a mother. The first pup came in a rush of pain that made Genevieve bite completely through her lower lip to keep from screaming and alerting any surviving rogues. The pup was tiny, slick, and barely breathing. Genevieve hastily cleaned him with her tongue, her maternal wolf instincts overriding her human exhaustion. She tucked him beneath the heavy fur cloak against her bare skin. but there was no time to rest. The second pup came minutes later, then the third. By the fifth pup, Genevieve was hemorrhaging. Her vision was swimming with black spots, and the edges of her consciousness were fraying. The temperature in the hollow was dropping, and the pups were shivering violently. She knew that if she passed out, they would all freeze to death within 20 minutes. To generate heat, a werewolf must shift. But shifting requires massive amounts of energy. Energy Genevieve simply didn't have. To attempt a shift while actively bleeding out was suicide. It would tear her remaining strength to shreds. "I am a daughter of the Silver Lake," she choked out to the empty, howling darkness. "I do not yield." She forced the shift. The agonizing crack of her bones, reforming, echoed in the tiny hollow. She didn't complete the transformation. It was too dangerous. But she forced her body into a half-shifted state. Her skin sprouted thick, insulating silver fur, and her body temperature spiked dangerously high. It was a state of biological overdrive, essentially burning her own life force to act as a furnace for her children. The 6th, 7th, and 8th pups were born into this desperate, bloody sanctuary. She cleaned them all, her massive, clawed hands, surprisingly gentle as she arranged them against her burning abdomen. Then came the 9th. It was a breech birth. Genevieve howled in pure, unadulterated torment, a sound that finally shattered the silence of the woods. She had to physically pull the pup from her own body, her claws slipping on the blood. When the 9th pup emerged, it was motionless. It wasn't breathing. Tears froze on Genevieve's cheeks as she nudged the tiny, stillborn creature with her muzzle. "No," she whimpered, a ragged, heartbroken sound. "No, you don't. You fight. You fight for me." She began to lick the pup vigorously, stimulating its tiny chest, breathing hot air over its face. For 5 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Genevieve's strength finally broke. She laid her head down on the bloody snow, her golden eyes dimming as her heart rate plummeted. She curled her massive, half-shifted body around the 9 tiny forms, creating a perfect, impenetrable dome of fur and heat. "I love you," she whispered into the freezing dark. "Live." As she closed her eyes, ready to surrender to the void, a tiny, raspy squeal erupted from the 9th pup. It began to squirm, fighting its way toward its mother's warmth, tiny lungs expanding with the freezing winter air. All 9 were alive. But outside the hollow, the snow was crunching. Heavy footsteps were approaching. A shadow fell over the entrance of the oak. Genevieve could not lift her head. She could not bare her fangs. If it was a rogue, she was completely defenseless. She tightened her grip on her children, waiting for the killing blow. The shadow that fell across the bleeding snow was not cast by a rogue assassin. It was a massive, hulking silhouette that blocked out the freezing wind entirely. Alistair dropped to his knees, the impact cracking the ice beneath the snow. The Alpha King, a warlord who had personally severed the heads of enemy generals without a flinch, let out a sound that would haunt the Aethelgard forest for centuries. It was not a roar of rage, but a fractured, devastating sob. The scent inside the hollow of the widow's root was a nightmare cocktail, the metallic tang of copious arterial blood, the sharp musk of exhausted magic, and the unmistakable sweet scent of newborn milk. Alistair crawled into the suffocatingly tight space. His glowing crimson eyes adjusted to the dark, and his breath hitched. There lay his fierce, unconquerable Genevieve. She was trapped in the agonizing limbo of a half-shift, her silver fur matted with crimson ice. Her eyes were rolled back, her breathing so shallow it was virtually undetectable, and buried deep within the burning furnace of her chest and abdomen lay a squirming, whimpering mass of life. 1, 2, 3. Alistair counted them, his mind refusing to comprehend the impossibility. 9. 9 living, breathing pups, the legendary Ennead litter, a myth recorded only in the fragmented Blackwood letters of 1493, penned by the controversial historian Sir Thomas Blackwood. "My heart," Alistair choked out, shifting back to his human form despite the sub-zero temperature. His bare skin burned against the ice as he carefully wrapped his massive arms around his mate. "Genevieve, stay with me. Do you hear my voice? I command you to stay." Genevieve's eyelids fluttered. A terrifyingly weak, raspy breath escaped her lips. She could not speak, but she managed to press her bloody muzzle against his jaw. Her fading pulse fluttered against his skin like a dying moth. She was bleeding out from the violent trauma of the 9th pup's breech birth. Alistair knew that moving her in this state would kill her instantly. He had only one option, a forbidden, ancient blood rite practiced by the primordial Lichen Kings. He drew his hunting dagger and, without a second of hesitation, sliced a deep, horizontal gash across his own left palm. "Drink," he whispered, pressing his bleeding hand to her jaws. "Take my strength. Take my life if you must. Just do not leave me." An alpha's blood is potent, laced with regenerative cellular magic that acts as pure, unadulterated adrenaline. As the warm blood dripped over Genevieve's tongue, a violent shudder racked her spine. Her golden eyes snapped open, glowing with sudden, feral intensity, as her body began to forcibly absorb the raw power. The hemorrhaging began to slow, her torn tissues knitting together at a microscopic level. It was not a cure, but it bought them time. With agonizing care, Alistair removed his own thick, fur-lined battle cloak. He gathered the 9 tiny pups, tucking them securely into the deep interior pockets of the heavy garment, pressing them against the bare heat of his chest. Then he lifted Genevieve. Even in her half-shifted, muscular state, she felt weightless to him. The journey back to High Reach Castle was a blur of driving snow and silent prayers. When Alistair finally kicked through the splintered oak doors of the Great Hall, the castle was a scene of controlled chaos. General Theodore Maxwell, commander of the King's vanguard, had arrived with reinforcements, securing the perimeter and executing the surviving rogues. "My king!" Maxwell shouted, rushing forward, his eyes widening at the sight of the unconscious Luna and the bloody bundle in Alistair's arms. "Prepare the royal chambers! Stoke every hearth to the maximum!" Alistair roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings. "And bring me Dr. Arthur Pendleton. Now!" Minutes later, Genevieve was laid upon the massive 4-poster bed, surrounded by boiling water, clean linens, and a dozen roaring fireplaces. The 9 pups, squirming and squealing, were placed in a massive, fur-lined basket beside her. Dr. Arthur Pendleton rushed into the room, his medical satchel clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The physician was a starkly thin man, with pale eyes and a nervous disposition. "My Alpha," he stammered, bowing deeply. "I was trapped in the apothecaries during the siege. Thank the goddess the Luna lives. Allow me to tend to her wounds." Alistair stepped back, his chest heaving as he watched the doctor approach his mate. But as Pendleton opened his leather satchel, Alistair's lichen senses, heightened to a razor's edge by the trauma of the night, caught a scent that froze the blood in his veins. It wasn't the scent of healing herbs. It was the pungent, bitter odor of Aconitum napellus. Monk's hood. Wolfsbane. The exact same strain that Reginald had used to paralyze the inner guard. Alistair's eyes locked onto the contents of the doctor's bag. Tucked beneath the bandages was a velvet-lined case containing 9 silver-inlaid vials and a heavy, leather-bound journal bearing the insignia of the Order of the Crimson Eclipse. A fanatical rogue cult obsessed with harvesting royal lichen bloodlines for immortality rituals. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Reginald was too arrogant too tactically inept to have orchestrated a siege of this magnitude. He was just the muscle, the true mastermind, the one who knew exactly how weak Genevieve was, the one who had predicted the impossible birth of 9 pups, was standing right in front of him. "Doctor," Alistair's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet octave, vibrating with lethal intent. "Why do you carry 9 extraction vials in a bag meant for saving my wife?" Pendleton froze. The colour drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He slowly turned, his hand inching toward a scalpel coated in paralyzing ash tree sap. "Because, Your Majesty," Pendleton sneered, his mask of subservience finally cracking, "a litter of 9 royal-born is not a blessing. It is a biological battery. With their blood, the Order could have ruled the continent." Pendleton lunged. For a man of such frail and unassuming stature, his speed was terrifyingly unnatural, a horrifying blur fueled by dark alchemical enhancements he had secretly injected into his own veins over the years. In his trembling hand, he gripped a surgical scalpel coated in a lethal, shimmering paste, a highly concentrated mixture of ash tree sap, liquid silver nitrate, and distilled aconitum napellus. He aimed the poisoned blade directly for Alistair's carotid artery, calculating that even a microscopic scratch would induce immediate paralytic shock in the Alpha King. This would buy the treacherous doctor just enough time to snatch at least 2 of the squirming pups from the fur-lined basket and vanish through the apothecary's secret tunnels. But Dr. Arthur Pendleton fundamentally misunderstood the primal nature of the monsters he was attempting to outmaneuver. Alistair did not even flinch. His lichen reflexes, honed by decades of brutal territorial warfare, reacted before his human brain even registered the threat. He didn't merely block the strike, he intercepted it with devastating precision. Alistair caught Pendleton's descending wrist mid-air, his massive fingers clamping down like a vice of solid iron. The sickening, wet crunch of completely shattering bone echoed off the vaulted stone ceilings of the bedchamber as Alistair's grip pulverized the physician's radius and ulna into jagged splinters. Pendleton let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, his fingers instantly going numb and dropping the poisoned scalpel to the stone floor with a sharp clatter. "You poisoned her," Alistair snarled. His voice had dropped to a dangerously quiet octave, a guttural vibration of pure, lethal intent that made the heavy oak furniture in the room rattle. He lifted the screaming doctor by his broken arm, hoisting him off the ground until Pendleton's frantic boots kicked empty air. The anomalous pregnancy, her extreme, unexplainable weakness. It wasn't natural. You have been lacing her morning teas and healing tonics with microdoses of wolfsbane for the last 9 months. You deliberately orchestrated her physical collapse, ensuring she would be too weak to survive the birthing process, leaving my heirs completely defenseless. It was for a higher purpose, Pendleton spat, a hysterical bloody froth bubbling at the corners of his lips as the pain caused his sanity to fracture. The Silver Lake bloodline combined with the ancient might of your ancestors, the Ennead prophecy. You ignorant brute, you do not understand the sheer, unadulterated power you hold in that basket. Alistair tightened his grip, cutting off the man's air supply. "Speak, traitor, before I tear your head from your shoulders." Pendleton gasped, his eyes bulging wildly. A litter of 9 royal-born, delivered precisely at the winter solstice under the frost of the bleeding moon. They are not mere children, Alistair. They are biological batteries of pure, primordial magic. Their bone marrow, their blood. It is the missing catalyst for the Order of the Crimson Eclipse. With the blood of the Ennead, the high priests of the Order could achieve true immortality. We could have ruled the entire European continent. We would have been gods, and the Order will never stop hunting them. Never. Even if you kill me, 100 more will take my place. Let them come, a raspy, utterly terrifying voice whispered from the centre of the room. Alistair and Pendleton both froze. Slowly, the Alpha King turned his head toward the massive four-poster bed. Genevieve, the Luna of high reach, had pushed herself upright against the heavy mahogany headboard. She was still deathly pale, her nightgown soaked through with her own crimson blood, and her breathing was ragged. Yet the raw, potent alpha blood she had ingested from Alistair's wrist had forcibly kick-started her cellular regeneration. Her golden eyes, which had been dim and lifeless mere moments ago, were now blazing with a furious, unyielding, demonic fire. The sheer, suffocating aura of a mother whose children had been threatened flooded the chamber, causing the roaring flames in the fireplaces to flicker and dim. She reached out with a trembling, claw-tipped hand and grasped the heavy, wrought-iron fireplace poker resting against the stone hearth. "Bring him here, Alistair," she commanded. It was not a request from a weakened patient. It was the absolute, irrefutable decree of a Luna passing a sentence of death. Alistair dragged the sobbing, broken physician across the intricately woven rugs, throwing him violently to his knees at the foot of the royal bed. Pendleton looked up into the glowing, remorseless eyes of the mother he had systematically tortured and tried to slaughter. In that fleeting second, the doctor finally understood true, paralyzing terror. "I kept 9 souls alive in the freezing, pitch-black heart of the Ethelgard forest," Genevieve whispered, leaning forward. The heat of the fire cast long, terrifying shadows across her beautiful, battle-hardened face. I bled out onto the ice. I shattered my own bones to keep them warm. I defied the goddess of death herself to protect my pack. She raised the heavy iron weapon, her muscles straining with the last reserves of her adrenaline. "Did you really think a pathetic, cowardly little man with a satchel of weeds could finish me?" With a sudden, violent surge of primal strength, Genevieve swung the iron poker downward. It struck Pendleton across the temple with a deafening crack, caving in his skull and ending his treason instantly. His lifeless body crumpled to the floor like a discarded rag doll. The silence that rushed in to fill the room was profound and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the logs in the hearth and the tiny, hungry, oblivious squeaks of the 9 pups nestled securely in their warm basket. The heavy iron weapon slipped from Genevieve's bloody fingers, clattering to the floor. The adrenaline left her system in a sudden rush, and she slumped back against the pillows. Alistair immediately dropped to his knees beside the bed, burying his face in Genevieve's lap, his broad, muscular shoulders shaking violently. The invincible, ruthless king of the Northern Territories finally allowed the sheer, suffocating terror of the night to crash over him. Genevieve let out a long, exhausted sigh, her bloody fingers gently stroking his thick, dark hair. "It is over, my love," she whispered into the quiet room, tears of pure relief finally spilling down her cheeks and dropping onto his armor. "We are safe. They are safe." The historical texts of the Lycan Order, specifically the heavily guarded Maxwell archives, record the spring that followed the frost of the Bleeding Moon as the bloodiest, yet most prosperous era in the history of the Northern Territories. The rogue factions, left terrifyingly leaderless and utterly panicked after the execution of the traitor Beta Reginald, were systematically hunted down. General Theodore Maxwell, commander of the King's vanguard, led a ruthless, perfectly executed military campaign that scoured the borders clean. But it was Alistair's personal vengeance upon the Order of the Crimson Eclipse that became the stuff of terrifying bedtime stories. The Alpha King did not merely defeat the fanatical cult, he made them a gruesome cautionary tale. For 3 months, Alistair waged a shadow war across the continent, tracking down every priest, every alchemist, and every sympathizer associated with the order, leaving their hidden strongholds as nothing more than smouldering piles of ash and shattered stone. Yet, inside the heavily fortified, rebuilt walls of High Reach Castle, the atmosphere was entirely different. The grand, echoing halls, once known only for the clanking of heavy plate armor and the grim shouting of military decrees, were now constantly filled with the chaotic, overwhelming, and joyful sounds of life. Genevieve had made a full, miraculous recovery. Her legendary survival in the freezing woods earned her the permanent moniker, the Iron Mother, among the northern packs, a title spoken with deep, unquestioning reverence. On a warm afternoon in late May, she sat on a carved stone bench in the sunlit courtyard, a stark, beautiful contrast to the frozen nightmare of the Ethelgard. Around her feet, 9 plump, wildly energetic, and fiercely independent wolf pups tumbled over each other in the lush green grass, testing their tiny, needle-like fangs on leather training boots and carved wooden toys. Alistair stood leaning against the heavy stone archway, his arms crossed over his chest, quietly watching his family. He bore a new, jagged white scar across his left palm, a permanent, physical reminder of the desperate blood rite that had saved his entire world. As Genevieve looked up from the playing pups and met his gaze, her golden eyes were warm, bright, and brimming with undeniable life. Alistair smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. He knew then one undeniable historical truth that no historian could ever truly capture on parchment. Armies could be outmaneuvered, traitors could infiltrate, and mighty stone castles could burn to the ground. But Aluna's love for her pups was a primal force of nature that not even death itself could conquer. Did the fierce devotion of the Silver Lake Luna and Alpha King Alistair capture your heart? If you want to hear more thrilling, blood-pumping werewolf romances and epic tales of survival, betrayal, and unbreakable mates, hit that like button right now, share this story with your pack, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for weekly fantasy drama. Turn on notifications so you never miss out.